right. So this is the fourth video of EOC prep. We are working on interdependence, which is basically food webs, energy in an ecosystem, and human impact. So first things first, under population dynamics, I would highly suggest drawing these two graphs. You don't have to draw this circle, but I would draw out that straight up line is exponential growth without limiting factors. So limiting factors are things that limit the growth of a population. So if we run out of food, population is not going to grow anymore. If there are no limiting factors, so without limiting factors, population is only going to increase. However, that's not reality. A lot of times there are limiting factors. So for example, at first, a population might increase, then reach those limiting factors, which causes it to reach this thing called carrying capacity. Make sure you are drawing this graph as well. So this graph is with limiting factors. This one over here is without limiting factors. Once a species reaches the point where it can't grow anymore, it reaches carrying capacity. Okay, the graph below shows the number of birds in a population. Which statement best explains section X on the graph? So what's going on with X? So we see the population is growing, then X, something happens. So is it because A, interbreeding between members of this population increased the mutations? This mentions nothing about breeding, so no. B, an increase in the bird population caused an increase in the producer population. Doesn't even show anything about producers. C, the population reached a state of dynamic equilibrium due to limiting factors. This is the only answer choice that mentions limiting factors. Once it reaches this point, it reaches this equilibrium or this balance where it doesn't grow anymore. So the answer is C. All right, 2. The graph shows changes in the size of a bacterial population over time in the presence of a limiting factor. As you can see, it's steady, then it grows, then it balances out. Limiting factor up here. Which labeled segment of the graph is most similar to how the population would change without limiting factors? So if you look back in the graphs that you should have just drawn in your notes, a graph without limiting factors would look like what? Let's see, segment 1. So if something does not have limiting factors, is it going to stay the same? No. Segment 2. Population without limiting factors is only going to increase. This segment only increases. Segment 2 is our answer. Okay, moving on. Also, you have another 2 population questions on your packet to go ahead and do on your own. Well, let's try human impact. So basically what you need to know is human impact. We are bad for the environment. Humans are awful for the environment. We pretty much do nothing good. So if there is a question that says, what is one way that humans harm the environment, literally read all of your answer choices. Whichever one sounds the worst is probably the right answer. So here's some things that we do to the environment. Pollution, increased CO2, which is carbon dioxide, pesticides, which are chemicals on grass, non-native species, so bringing in a species that is not from there and putting it into an environment, global warming, animal extinction, so getting rid of species, industrialization, so building a bunch of factories, and destruction of habitat, cutting down a bunch of trees. Some key notes. Pesticides are bad for eating. Pesticides are chemicals. If you ingest it, you will probably die. Cutting down trees increases carbon dioxide. If you cut down a bunch of trees, you're going to increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Other key things to definitely write down. Renewable is good. Non-renewable is bad. Anytime you see renewable, that's a good thing. Anytime you see something that says non-renewable, that is a bad thing. Okay, bald eagles nest in trees and feed on fish. Which statement explains the most likely way that a pesticide, or a chemical, used on crops could harm bald eagles living a few miles away? So how could this pesticide harm these bald eagles? A, the pesticide could wash down creeks and harm the eagles when they dive into the water to catch the fish. B, the pesticide could wash down creeks and accumulate or build up in the fish that the eagles eat. So then the eagles eat the fish that have the pesticide. That's basically like the eagles eating the pesticide. That is bad. The pesticide could get blown into the air. Those chemicals are not going to get blown into the air and hit the eagles while they're flying. No, that's kind of crazy. Pesticide could get blown into the air and harm the trees. No, we're a few miles away. That's not going to happen. Our answer is B. That one involves the eagle eating the pesticide. Bad news. Okay. A non-native fish is introduced into an estuary, which is just a stream. If it's non-native, it is not from there. What will most likely happen to the population of native fish, so the fish that are from there? The native fish will increase because they will prey on the non-native fish. B, the native fish populations will decrease because they must now compete with the non-native fish for resources. C, their populations will stay the same. Or D, their populations will stay the same. So we know their populations aren't going to stay the same, so we can get rid of C and D. If we bring a new fish into the stream, most likely thing that's going to happen is that it's going to mess everything up because the native fish are not going to have as much food anymore because they're competing for those resources. All right, moving on to food webs. Here are some key things to write down about food webs. If the arrow is pointing at something, it is doing the eating. If the arrow is pointing away from something, it is being eaten. Here are some vocab words to go with our food web. So autotroph, kind of like we learned in the evolution video, is self-feeding. These are our producers, our plants. They can make their own food. Heterotroph cannot make its own food, so these are our animals. Herbivore is something that only eats plants, and carnivore is something that eats other animals. So, food webs. Arrow is pointing away from the penguin, so the penguin is being eaten. Arrow is pointing to the seal, or whatever the heck this thing is. So this thing is doing the eating. All right, so let's take a look at number 1 in your packet, the lake food web. Crawfish are one of the many invertebrates in this lake food web. Given the information in this food web, which change would cause a decrease in the crawfish population? So right off the bat, we don't see crawfish labeled on here. But the question tells us that they are invertebrates, so we are going to be looking at this part. So we want to know what change would cause a decrease in this population. What would cause invertebrates to go down? So A, removing the carp. Removing the carp would get rid of a competitor because invertebrates eat this thing and so do the carp. Arrow is pointing at the carp. Arrow is pointing at the invertebrates. So if we remove the carp, that's going to increase our invertebrates. So that would not be true. B, removing the bass. So the bass eats the invertebrates. If we remove something that's eating the invertebrates, that is going to cause their population to grow, not decrease. So that's not true. C, adding more sunfish. What do sunfish eat? Well, look at that. They eat invertebrates. So if we added more sunfish in there, they're going to eat a lot more of these. That would cause their population to go down. So the answer you should have for number 1 is C. Number 2 is just the opposite. We want to know what now in this food web is going to cause an increase in the invertebrates. What's going to cause this to increase? A, removing the carp. Well, if we first of all, this is going through something else. But if we decrease the sunfish, that's totally going to increase our invertebrates. Also, if we increase this food, that will also increase our invertebrates, but that's not one of our answer choices. If we remove the carp, if we get rid of the carp, that is going to increase our invertebrates because they are competing against each other. All right. Next one is flow of energy.